Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Johnson, the Chief Operating Officer for Tetra Tech's International Development Services team. I'm also a proud member of the SID Washington Executive Board. It's my honor to welcome you to this exciting panel today on environmental implications of infectious disease. It's a really important topic. Today, we've brought together a really distinguished panel of experts to share their perspectives, including USAID, academia, and implementing partners. As we all know, health emergencies such as COVID-19 pose a global risk and show us the critical need for prevention and preparedness. And we all know ensuring healthy lives is essential to sustainable development. Today's important panel really showcases the many different key stakeholders and expertise needed to take action to prevent and reduce the risk and spread of zoonotic disease and future pandemics. So let me now welcome John Parker, Tetra Tech's Director of Environmental and Natural Resources Sector, who will be moderating to today's panel. Thank you, John, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Mark, and welcome everyone to what should be a very interesting discussion on what is an incredibly timely and urgent topic. And so the focus of our discussion today will be on environmental implications of emerging infectious diseases. Before we dive into things, I want to spend a minute just providing a little bit of context on why this panel and why this topic. We know, of course, that COVID has really brought to the forefront the critical linkages between environmental threats and human health outcomes, and specifically how these intertwined issues influence the emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases. COVID is not the first outbreak that likely has its origins in wildlife. It follows Ebola, Nipah virus, SARS, among several others. But what is clear with COVID is that the scale and impacts of these outbreaks are increasing. We also know that ecological degradation through land use change and habitat fragmentation increases disease risk and potential spillover from animals to humans, as do, of course, complex issues around wildlife trade and bushmeat consumption. So given the critical importance of addressing these issues and really thinking about how to improve our preparedness and response both now and in the future, we brought together an expert panel here today with some leading thinkers on these topics to really try to unpack these complex issues and bring a range of different perspectives. So I'd like to introduce each of our panelists, and we'll then lay out the agenda for this afternoon's discussion. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Patricia Bright with us today. Dr. Bright is the Senior One Health Technical Advisor at USAID. She's currently detailed to USAID from the Department of Interior, where she serves as the Senior Science Advisor for Health and the Environment. She's been serving as the technical lead for USAID's Global Health Security Division's work with the FAO. In addition, Dr. Bright is assuming the role of USAID lead for a very exciting new project that's directly focused on these issues called Stop Spillover. We're very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Bright today and learning more about this new project and USAID's focus on these issues. We are also privileged to have Dr. Hellen Amuguni with us today. Dr. Amuguni is an associate professor of infectious disease and global health at Tufts University's Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. She previously served as Tufts Senior Technical Lead for the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threats One Health Workforce Project for Africa. She brings expertise on a wide range of topics, but particularly One Health, epidemiology, and gender analysis. We're also very excited to have Sabri Zain with us today from the UK, so appreciate Sabri joining us in the evening, his time. Sabri's the Director of Policy at Traffic, which, as many of you know, is a leading NGO working globally on issues related to wildlife trade. He brings extensive experience in communications and policy development related to wildlife conservation. So welcome to our three panelists. We have a lot to cover in now what is less than, 50 minutes. So let me very quickly explain how we will sequence the agenda of the panel. First, each panelist is going to provide some initial framing remarks on the topic, what specifically it means to them and their respective organizations, as well as their perspectives on the critical issues. We will then follow this with a structured discussion, and then this will be followed by an opportunity for the audience to ask some questions. We'll wrap things up with some closing remarks from each panelist and try to do all of this within the allotted time, so wish us luck. And so for opening remarks, we're going to start with Dr. Bright. Dr. Bright, welcome. Great to have you with us, and please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. As you said, this is such a timely topic, and we're really excited to have the opportunity to discuss it with you and the other panelists. So if you can go ahead to the next slide, Aaron. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the term One Health, and I assume that some of you who are listening know what that term is, and some may not. So if you're not familiar with the term One Health essentially is the concept that human health, animal health, and health of the environment are all kind of inextricably linked. So as John alluded to earlier, many of the diseases that we're seeing today really have overlap between humans, animals, and or the environment. Many of you who work in the disease world have heard this statistic before, but about 60% of the diseases that we're seeing today are kind of newly occurring diseases. So these are things like HIV, SARS, Ebola. Of those 60%, approximately 75% are zoonotic in nature, so of course transmissible between animals and people. So clearly this is a really important topic. One of the challenges, I think, in dealing with One Health, aside from the fact that our segments are often, these sectors are often very siloed, is that there's some misconceptions, I think, about One Health. And, we kind of have a joke, those of us who work in the environmental side, some of you have heard me say this before, but we often jokingly refer to it as two-thirds health. Right? Because when you talk to a lot of people, they talk about human health and they talk about animal health, but they forget about that whole component of the environment. And that is so critically important. So I'm really delighted that we're here today having this conversation. One of the things I've shared with you here on this slide is a recent definition that USAID came up with. So it's kind of our definition of One Health that we use agency-wide. And you can see we said One Health is a collaborative transdisciplinary approach. It recognizes the interdependence among the health of the environment, wildlife, and domestic animals and humans to achieve resilience and sustainable outcomes across complex systems from local to global levels. One thing I really want to point out here is that in most definitions, you will see this referred to as the health of humans, animals, and the environment. You'll notice here that we put the environment first in our definition, and that was for a reason, because we really want people to understand that you cannot separate the environment from these other issues. So in terms of USAID, because we are dealing with COVID like everyone else, global health a lot of our work has been built on that kind of One Health foundation for years. But over the past couple of months, we've started working more closely together to try to figure out how do we bring this across agency. So it's not just global health. We're also working with our colleagues over in the Bureau for Resiliency and Food Security. We're also working with our folks on the environmental and climate side. And we're also working with our humanitarian assistance people because they, of course, deal with natural disasters. And so they're dealing with health and other kind of issues that are associated with migration and things like that. So Aaron, can you go to the next slide, please? I'm not seeing the slides on my screen, but I assume we have moved forward. Oh, it looks like we may have lost Hannah. Okay, hopefully she will keep going. She'll come back and she'll be able to put up the next slide. So the next slide is basically a graphic. And it talks, and what I really wanted to focus on was, again, that role of the environment in One Health. And it kind of starts out talking about a number of the factors, some of those John alluded to, whether that's wildlife trade, whether it's climate change, whether it's urbanization, land use, poor management practices. There's a whole bunch of factors that influence how the environment affects disease. And one of the most important things I really want you to leave here with today, if you remember nothing else that I say, is when we talk about One Health, remember that we're not just talking about infectious disease, okay? So when you see this graphic, you'll see there's a number of different diseases, right? We can talk about toxicological, nutritional, metabolic. And so when we're talking about those various diseases, they all kind of can work together and interact within an organism, whether that's people or animals, to create some additional complications here on the environmental side. So when we think about things like some of the contaminants and toxins that are out there, pesticides that act as endocrine disrupting chemicals, can actually suppress the immune system. If a person or an animal is not, it doesn't have good nutritional status, that can certainly affect their ability to be infected with a disease or for a disease to spill over and be transmitted. So I just, again, if nothing else, I want you to really leave here with this idea that when we talk about One Health, please remember that it is more than just infectious diseases. There's a whole host of diseases out there. And in the past, we've kind of siloed those out, particularly the infectious diseases and the contaminant side of things. And it's really important to remember that we need to look at this very holistically. Hannah, can you go to the next slide? I'm going to finish up really quickly here. I just wanted to talk for a moment about our new project that John mentioned. It is called Stop Spillover, or Strategies to Prevent Spillover. So this is a new project. It's just been awarded. It's $100 million over 5 years. We're going to be working up to 10 countries in Asia and Africa. And we're going to be working on selected viruses. These are some known viruses like Ebola, like Nipah. And the whole idea here is, many of you are familiar with the work that USAID has done in the past, particularly around viral discovery. We're really kind of pivoting. That work was really super important. It gave us a lot of good information, but this is a whole new direction that we're taking here. This project is really kind of bringing us back to our development roots, and it's really going to be a focus on capacity building and sustainability. So the consortium is actually going to be led by Tufts University, and actually Dr. Amuguni, who's on the panel as well, is going to be a part of that project, as well as Tetra Tech. So we've got some really fantastic people. They're really bringing a breadth of wildlife disease, human disease, and environmental health to this project. Some of the things that we're going to be focusing on going forward, there's kind of three main objectives here. We really want to better understand the factors that contribute to the risk of transmission from wildlife to humans. So we know, again, there's been some work that's been done kind of at the global level, proof of concept. We really want to take this down to the country level to understand this country context. The second component to this is developing, assessing, and implementing early country risk-specific reduction and interventions. And, our goal here is really to try to get as far upstream as we can, right? The earlier we can detect these and deal with them, the less economic and health impacts we'll have. And then the third component of this is strengthening health systems to rapidly recognize and respond to disease outbreaks. So the biggest points I would like you to take away from this as well are that we really want this project to create critical local One Health partnerships. We're really looking to build on the networks and systems that are there. But we also really want to reach out to some of those fringe groups, the extractive industry groups, some of the wildlife and forestry folks, some of the folks that would be particularly important when we're in a conflict zone and we can't get to them. These folks are out there, they're in the field, they know what's happening, and we can really provide some good information. We really want to ensure sustainability. So again, this idea that we really need to be looking at what's feasible for these countries, what do they currently have, what are they working with, and how do we build into that? And then second or third, what we really, really want to focus on as well is the importance of sharing data and knowledge. So throughout this project, we hope to be doing a lot of transparency, a lot of communication, working with our partners, both within USAID, across the U.S. government, and other partners. We're really looking to leverage other projects that are out there and to see how we can work together to develop these partnerships. So I will end there, but we're really excited about this, and we're really excited about having the opportunity to work with our partners on this. So we'll share more information as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patty. I think that was an excellent framing of the issues, and in particular the concept of One Health and how this is being defined within the agency, and how USAID intends to address the issue moving forward. And thanks also for the overview of Stop Spillover. I suspect that many people were very interested to learn more about this, and congratulations to you and USAID for getting this project off the ground. So next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Hellen Amuguni from Tufts University to provide her opening remarks.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, John, for this opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm really excited about infectious disease. I have an infectious disease background. That's sort of my training. And I wanted to start by sort of just giving you a couple of statistics that you probably know. About 75% of emerging infectious diseases of humans are of animal origin, mostly wildlife. And the emerging diseases have been increasing. The last few years, 5 new diseases emerge every year. And 3 out of those 5 are of animal origin and mostly wildlife. And so these linkages between habitat fragmentation, human-wildlife interface, and emerging pandemic threats is really, really significant. And we cannot be able to separate what happens in the environment with what happens in a hospital. And so the One Health concept, as Patricia has talked about it, is really, really important. It's a global framework now that we can use to strengthen collaboration and partnerships across different institutions and across many different actors. First slide, please. This first slide sort of summarizes what causes disease emergence and spillover. And when we look at emergence, we're talking about habitats, human encroachment on habitats, exploitation of those habitats, climate variability. These are the areas that we talk about all the time. Ecological pressure, the vector density and distribution. Then an outbreak moves on to become an epidemic. And at this level, there's amplification of this epidemic, you know? And so some of the causes of that are urbanization, population density, agricultural intensification in different areas. And of course, this is very much related to what we see at the beginning. You want to intensify agricultural production, you spread into forested areas, you cut down trees, and therefore you increase close communication or close contact between humans and wild animals most of the time. And of course, vector distribution. Then it becomes a pandemic, like what we've seen with coronavirus, and that's because of globalization. It's not just sitting in China, it spreads across the world. And all of a sudden we have millions and millions of people affected and others dead at the same time. Next slide, please. And so one of the things I wanted to really mention is that when we talk about emerging pandemics, and we're thinking in terms of environmental factors, we can't just focus on that alone. It's a wider circle. And I think Patricia also mentioned a little bit of that, is that when we are talking about what happens in climate, you know, to change the climate, most of the time it's humans who are at the center of this. And you think about it, how is what humans are doing affecting their lives, their livelihoods? Are there economic factors that are related to increasing wildlife contact between humans and animals, you know? Are there gender and cultural factors that cause this? What about the behavioral risks? What about, and just giving an example of what's happening with us, what about conflicts? What about governance? So these are some of the issues that sort of spread the cycle and make it wider, so that we just don't think about environment. We look at those behavioral risks, those factors, those economic factors. There could be social factors, there could be cultural factors that really lead to food insecurity, maybe, and therefore cause people who are food insecure to maybe go out hunting or go out searching for food. And so as we think about the One Health concept, and we think about the human, animal, environmental factors that lead to that, we have to think about the bigger disciplinary group of people who would be involved in this. Would they be anthropologists? Would they be economists? Would you be thinking about forestry people? Many times these have been left out of the One Health movement. So what I'm saying is that as we think through the process of using One Health, we gotta think wider and think who else should be on the table at the community level. Are we just talking about the government policy makers? Or are we thinking about the community person who actually has a wildlife farm? And so next slide, please. And so as we think about all these different issues that help us to address the issue of pandemics, like what we have right now, the coronavirus, Ebola previously, influenza, my thinking is that we have to first of all think of how do we build a competent, skilled, multidisciplinary public health workforce. We need people who are trained across multiple disciplines, not just human, animal, environment as we know it. We need all those other disciplines that I've also mentioned. And I like to give an example of Kenya. I originally come from Kenya. When the pandemic happened in Kenya, airlines stopped moving around, and that happened across the world also. No one would think that the airline industry should be involved in pandemic preparedness. But when we begin to think about those other teams, private sector, extractive industry, mining, forestry, people who don't automatically come to your mind, the non-traditional people, then we begin to build a really good system for response in that. And of course, it has to be very community driven. we have to understand that a pandemic occurs in a community. It doesn't start in a government office. It doesn't start in a hospital. It actually occurs within a community. And so thinking about that community, their needs, where they're coming from, the risks, the consequences and impacts of that is really important. And one last thing to mention, as sort of like some of the non-conventional, traditional, non-traditional public health workforce that we have in our communities. I believe that those are really, really important. I think about traditional medicine men. I think about maybe wildlife farmers. I think about people who communicate with WhatsApp, all these other tools that we are using across. Those are really important to bring into the sphere of One Health, and they can really work well to help us prevent zoonotic disease emergence. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Helen. You raised a number of really important and interesting points, particularly the progression and linkages between emergence, amplification, and globalization. The spillover ecosystem graphic was also very interesting, and really kind of thinking through the comprehensive range of factors and how that influences behaviors that can in turn create spillover, and of course the stakeholders that need to be engaged and at what level. And of course we'll touch on these points much more in the discussion. I'd like to welcome Sabri Zain from Traffic as our next speaker to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having me here. I'm the Director of Policy, as you see, for Traffic, which is a wildlife trade monitoring network. So much of my presentation will focus primarily on the issue of wildlife trade. Reports of the source of the outbreak being a market where wild animals were on sale certainly have put wildlife trade firmly on the spotlight in this global emergency. But it really should be no surprise that wildlife trade is at the root of this problem. As mentioned earlier by the speakers, we've seen zoonotic disease outbreaks increasing, and this is partly due to the human pressures on the natural world, including encroachment on wild habitats, hunting of wild animals, and climate change. There are conventions such as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, that govern the international wildlife trade, and these are reflected in national laws and regulations as well. Well, there clearly is a lot more that needs to be done to ensure that this legislation and conventions are more effectively implemented. I think the crucial flaw in wildlife trade legislation and conventions is that they're often designed to address overexploitation and illegal activity and conservation. They're not designed to address health and disease control. And wildlife trade legislation certainly needs to take into account veterinary and animal and public health legislation to fully eliminate all the risks that wildlife trade may present to public health. And we really need to do more to understand how these different types of legislation and regulations complement each other, who's responsible for implementing them, and how their different roles can be mutually supportive. I'd also like to talk about the socio-economic impacts of COVID. Beyond the immediate public health impacts, we're also now experiencing devastating socio-economic impacts. And this issue is at the heart of sustainable development and conservation. This pandemic has placed countries in complete economic lockdown and social lockdown, and is set to usher in a global economic recession. And this negative economic impact on the already fragile economies of many developing countries will be even more significant and has already been predicted by organizations such as the African Union, OECD, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. In addition, the growing calls for the closure of wildlife markets and wildlife bans as a result of the pandemic, they're actually threatening to drive much of the illicit and unsustainable trade further underground. And they'll also have a detrimental impact on wildlife that is legally and sustainably used for the benefit of conservation and local communities in much of the developing world. Efforts to ensure legal and sustainable trade in wild species can be undermined by poorly considered and simplistic responses to a crisis, leading to significant loss of food security and livelihoods to many communities and to national economies that are already under pressure from global recession. And rural communities will always tend to fall back on wildlife resources in times of economic hardship as a coping strategy. And governments may see unfettered exploitation of wildlife, timber, and fisheries as one of its strategies to avoid economic catastrophe. Efforts must therefore help communities and governments to meet those economic needs while ensuring their use is sustainable and safe. On the issue of One Health, efforts by just one sector cannot prevent or eliminate future pandemics. And a well-coordinated approach in addressing human, animal, and environmental health is required. This One Health approach can only work with the collaboration of many professionals, as mentioned by the previous speakers, with a range of expertise in different sectors such as public health, animal health, wildlife management, economic development, wildlife use and trade, nature conservation, and climate change. Governments need to consider the establishment of multi-agency and multidisciplinary task forces to ensure that all these different experts and sectors have shared objectives, clear roles, effective information sharing, and close collaboration in the effective implementation of actions, incorporating health, socioeconomic, and conservation considerations as part of a one government approach to implementing wild health. Conservation authorities and conservation organizations such as mine also play an important role in the One Health approach. For traffic, for example, it is for managing zoonotic disease risk. It's really important to map out where the wildlife trade risk areas are, areas that are at risk of facilitating the transmission of zoonotic disease. This includes, points of entry and exit, such as airports, seaports, and land borders, local and international trade flows, what the common species in trade are, and what are the levels of trade involved, and where are the markets where this wildlife may be sold and where wildlife processing businesses operate. This is exactly the kind of knowledge that we as conservationists monitor, document, and analyze on a routine basis. And this knowledge of risk areas can help epidemiologists, public health authorities, and veterinarian authorities to minimize disease risk. For organizations already focused on wildlife trade, such as traffic, we are committed to mobilize action on our existing areas of expertise, such as market monitoring, designing and analyzing regulatory and market-based approaches and solutions, including traceability systems, capacity building in support of trade monitoring, and design of consumer behavior change messaging, and impact and evaluation of the impacts of trade. And we look forward to working with others in the coming years in tackling this global change together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sabri. Some very important points, particularly on gaps in wildlife trade legislation, some of the unintended consequences of policy decisions, and also some strategies that can be taken moving forward. And so, I think that was an excellent framing of some of the critical issues, the existing gaps and opportunities to address them moving forward. I'd like to now dig a bit deeper with the three of you on these topics, particularly in terms of what actions we can carry out moving forward. And so to do this, I'd like to focus in on questions related to three specific areas. The first will relate to what we can do to better detect and monitor zoonotic disease emergence and spillover. The second set of questions will relate to implementation and how we can more effectively advance these efforts on the ground. And the third question will be looking more towards the future. So related to detection, my first question is for Patty and Hellen. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of early warning and surveillance capacity, and what types of measures are needed to more effectively detect and assess risk of zoonotic disease emergence and spillover. And related to that, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the recommended scale of risk analysis and surveillance, given, of course, the cross-scale dynamics of the issues and problems. So, would you recommend that these focus on the national level, the regional level, the global level, all of the above? So let's first start with Patty, and then we can move to Hellen.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, this is such an interesting topic. Surveillance there are just so many challenges out there. Doing first of all, I think that all of those levels, the local, the global, the regional are all important, and they all have their place. I think, one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure Hellen can speak to this as well, is, doing kind of large scale surveillance is extremely resource intensive. And it's expensive. You need a lot of people to do it. And people get surveillance fatigue, right? We did that here in the United States with avian influenza and migratory birds and poultry. And after a while, the money runs out, people kind of move on to the next disease, even though the threat is still there. So I think in terms of surveillance, there's a number of challenges. In terms of wildlife, a lot of the diagnostic tests that are out there aren't necessarily validated in wildlife or don't exist for wildlife. So that, from a technology standpoint, is an issue. If you are dealing with diseases in remote areas and you need to get them to laboratories, there's often issues with transmitting those samples and things. So again, from a diagnostic standpoint, more kind of point of care or pen side diagnostics would be really helpful. I think also thinking about, as I said, surveillance, that large scale surveillance is very expensive. And so thinking about what are some other ways that we can use, what other tools are out there to help us target that surveillance. So I actually work for the U.S. Geological Survey. So we do a lot of what we call GeoInt, right? We use satellite data and other things that can help us determine, looking at what some of those environmental factors are, whether those are climate related or deforestation or soil types or whatever, to help us target once we know what those characteristics are that are going to create that high risk area. Can we use some of those other tools to help us figure out how to target that down? Because I think the large scale surveillance is really not something we're going to be able to afford to do, particularly in these developing countries, not over the long term. So Hellen, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. And I'll look at it also to just add something about early warning. And I do believe that we can take advantage of some of the measures that already exist, or some of the things that already exist on the ground. So, for example, we have people on the ground, partners on the ground in different countries who are already doing like socio-ecological monitoring in communities, especially in biodiversity hotspots and areas facing these kinds of threats. So taking advantage of those maybe community-based conservation organizations that are actually on the ground already doing something, and taking advantage of extension people. And I'll give an example. In many countries in Africa, we have wildlife extension officers who are always driving around parks looking for poachers. Being able to use those kind of people to actually help out with surveillance, training them to be able to collect data and provide that information, then you're not building a whole new system. You're taking advantage of people on the ground. I know that in the livestock area, we've used WhatsApp as a communication tool for disease monitoring across different countries with pastoralist communities. How would we be able to take those kind of communication tools that are already being used for something else to actually use them for surveillance? I think right now, a lot of surveillance for emerging pandemics has been focused on animals, wildlife. How about humans? We always wait for humans to show up in the hospital when they're sick. So maybe starting like longitudinal surveillance, adding surveillance of humans, maybe virology, serology, not necessarily in a whole country, but maybe picking a particular area. It could be an area where you think this is a hotspot area and beginning to do that for humans, then and look at seasonality, what is associating it with spillover. So those are some of the things I would just recommend for putting in place, like some more early warning systems. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I would add to that too. I think
ahead,
using the momentum of COVID, one of the big issues we've had sometimes with surveillance in the past is just getting people to share information, whether that's between countries or regions. And so, you know, with COVID, it's all fresh in everyone's mind how easily these diseases move around. And I think we need to take advantage of that momentum to really try to open up these communication channels to get people to share information more readily.
Thanks so much. Really interesting points and recommendations. And Sabri, let's stay on this particular topic for another minute. My next question's for you, and you touched on this a bit during your opening remarks, but specifically related to wildlife trade. How would you say we can more effectively strengthen monitoring and traceability of wildlife trade networks, and particularly identify and detect hotspots or critical risk areas?
I mean, internationally, there's already the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species CITES, which has, you know, quite a structured program of monitoring levels of trade and populations of species that are listed as protected or regulated under CITES. But that is only limited to species that are in CITES. There are many other species that are not in CITES. So there are a lot of gaps that need to be filled, and frequently it's civil society organizations such as ours that need to fill those gaps. So yes, there's more effort and resources are needed to sort of gather more information to identify sort of the high-risk species involved, the levels of trade involved, how they are used, whether it's for meat or medicine or as pets, where those species are being consumed, and to understand, quite complex issues such as social behavior change. Why are consumers why are consumers buying these species and consuming them, and what alternatives can we develop and provide to ensure that we meet their needs with a supply of a commodity that is both sustainable and safe. So hopefully government agencies and donor agencies are now more aware of the strong link between wildlife and human health, and that we're going to see more investment in this kind of evidence gathering as part of global efforts to reduce the risk of pandemics. But how more crucial perhaps than the gathering of the evidence is how we share the evidence, is the information and knowledge that we as conservationists gather on high-risk species. Is it reaching all the right people in the animal and public health sector or the epidemiologists? And are they using that information? So new partnerships and collaboration certainly must be struck now. And we have to make sure that this regular information sharing takes place. I mean, on my part, I'm already promising you that after this meeting, I'll be contacting Patricia and Hellen and see how there are any ways in which traffic can work together with them in mutually supporting our efforts.
Great. Thanks so much, Sabri. So let's move to implementation. I'm sure many of our audience members are interested to hear your perspectives of how this is all playing out on the ground and what specific interventions can be implemented. So my first question is for all three of you. I'd like your thoughts on some specific country-level examples of successful implementation of One Health approaches and strategies, particularly examples of effective cross-sectoral integration or implementation that really kind of brings together environment, animal, and human health considerations. So what does this look like on the ground? And perhaps we can also speak to sort of scaling issues and whether these interventions are scalable, or there are examples of that. So perhaps, Hellen, we can start with you, and then we'll go to Sabri and then Patty.
Okay, so probably my first example goes to the creation of multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral response teams. I think we saw that I worked in the last 8 years with the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threat Program. And one of the things that we focused on was try to build these break silos and build multi-sectoral teams that can easily come together and respond to an outbreak. And I'll give you an example of Uganda. Right now, actually, the head of the Uganda COVID-19 response is a veterinarian. And not only that, as part of their team, they have economists, they have anthropologists, they have medical doctors. They've created really this great multi-sectoral response team. And it has been effective over the last few years in responding to any outbreak. One of the things that it does is they're able to share resources. They're able to share resources. Just to give you a simple example is, if you have a team going to the field, you have the medical team taking their own vehicle, you have the vets taking another vehicle, you have the environmental people taking their vehicle. Those are 3 vehicles. This is sort of the simplest example. Those are 3 vehicles, SUVs going to the field. But when you're collaborating together, you're like, we're going to take 1 vehicle, we're going to take the other resources and buy PPE. You see, so that just being a simple, if you are communicating all the time, then you don't have to wait for the information to go all the way to the national level with the Ministry of Health before it comes down to the veterinary department, because you're already communicating across, you have this task force that's already communicating across. One other example related to communication is simply using local people on the ground. And these are things that we've been able to do, using local people on the ground to pass information to another team. So I'll give you an example. Community health workers are in the villages. They're everywhere in so many, in different homes, in many different homes, as opposed to vets. Vets are not as many. But if a community health worker comes to a home and they find out that there's a sick animal, as well as sick people, then all they need to do is just call the vet and say, hey, while I was on my rounds, I saw sick animals in this place. That passes the information very fast. The vet is able to come in and they're able to respond as fast as possible. So keeping those communication lines open. This is as a result of One Health. And then the last one is what we talked about, evidence. I think gathering evidence that multidisciplinary measures work. And this is really good for policy. If we have such evidence, we have models, then we find that countries are able to actually base their policies on that. So those are some of the things that we've been able to do, gather evidence that One Health works, provide that to policymakers, give examples of like, hey, with the Rift Valley fever outbreak in Rwanda, we went out as a multidisciplinary team and we did this, and therefore we cut your financial resources to this amount instead of this amount. I think policy makers understand money a lot more than anything else. So yes, those are just some few examples. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. I'm conscious of the time here. I knew it was a tall order for us to cover all of this in such a short period of time. And there's some great questions coming in from the audience. So maybe quickly, either Patty or Sabri, any additional thoughts on this topic? Any quick points you'd like to make?
I think Helen mentioned just now the role of wildlife enforcement officers, and I think she'll like my example because Traffic recently was involved in developing this wildlife law enforcement course for wildlife law enforcement officers in Zanzibar, and this was part of USAID's promoting Tanzania's environment conservation and tourism project, Protect. I mean, this was a course on wildlife trade and zoonotic disease. And a major component of this course is explaining to wildlife officers the various pieces of legislation that support the One Health approach. So explaining to them what are the various provisions in Tanzania's Veterinary Act and Animal Diseases Act. What are the different provisions that are found in Tanzania's Public Health Act #1. And as well as explaining to them who is responsible for the implementation of this legislation and who they should contact if they can detect non-compliance with this legislation. So hopefully wildlife officials are now more aware of the main provisions of these regulations, the government departments responsible for implementing them and who to report violations to. And this can only ensure strong communication and collaboration between wildlife, animal and public health officials to mutually support their respective regulatory approaches and enhance the detection and reporting of new and emerging risks. This is a simple thing to do, and I think it can be replicated with changes in many other countries.
Great, thank you, Sabri. And let me just move to the final discussion question, and then we can take a couple of questions from the audience. And with this final question, I'd like to take a look towards the future. And so thinking about the pandemic now and the steps we need to take as a global community to address these future threats, I'd be curious to hear each of your thoughts on one thing that we have done well or are doing well currently to be better prepared for the future. I'd also like your quick thoughts on the flip side of that and one thing that is still critically missing and needs greater attention. And I suspect there may be many things, but let's try to boil this down a little bit to the one item or issue that you feel is most important. So Patty, maybe we can start with you, not to put you on the spot.
No, that's great. I think one of the things that we're doing really well is that we really have brought multiple sectors together to deal with it. I think everyone realizes this is not something that can be dealt with through one sector, and I feel like there is a lot of momentum around that. That will lead me into kind of what I think the biggest challenge is here, and we've seen this over and over and over, whether it's Ebola or highly pathogenic avian influenza or West Nile virus, is there's a lot of resources put into these to this outbreak, and then people get kind of exhausted by it. People lose interest. The threat is still there, and so we spend a lot of time building these networks and resources and getting everything up and running. And then when the funding falls off or gets redirected, everything kind of goes down into a curve. And the next disease or the next outbreak that happens, we start at the bottom again, and we're frantically trying to build those networks and those resources and those systems. And we can't keep doing that. There needs to be consistency. And I'm hoping, because this has been a global pandemic, that decision makers will understand that, and that we will continue to keep resources, even when there's not an outbreak, that we will have some kind of stable level so that these networks and systems and resources stay in place.
Excellent, Patty. Thank you. Hellen.
I would say the one thing that we're doing well is the science part of it. I think there's so many people working on finding out what the disease is, who does it affect, how is it transmitted, and trying to develop a vaccine in relation to that. I would say on the other side, the thing that I think we're not doing very well is the private sector engagement in these areas. I think there are private sector partners that should be a part of this. And even just to mention environment, many times when we've thought about One Health, it has just really been human animal, and people tend to push environment on the side. Bringing that centering that, and centering all these private sector partners, like I talked about forestry, aquaculture, extractive industry. A lot of these outbreaks start within those areas, those hotspots. So recognizing that they're really important partners and bringing them on board. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Hellen. Sabri.
One thing that I'm optimistic about in terms of preparing the way forward is we're soon going to have what's called a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Some of you may know that this is the strategic plan which replaces the Aichi biodiversity targets that were set 10 years ago. There was a report last week that said we're not going to meet any of those Aichi biodiversity targets. I was involved in some of the negotiations for this new post-2020 biodiversity framework, and I'm happy to report that it's a much more targeted, achievable, and feasible set of targets that countries around the world are setting themselves up for. But most important of all, from my perspective, for the first time ever, we're going to have wildlife trade and use targets by which we can measure our progress on addressing this issue. And there are targets that specifically address the issue of public health. So the wildlife trade target mentions about ensuring that trade is legal, sustainable, and safe. And this is a paradigm shift for biodiversity conservation. So I'm confident of that. The one thing that is critically missing, and we've talked a lot about the importance of the One Health approach today, but I think we still haven't done enough to join the dots, and a lot more needs to be done in terms of striking out those partnerships and finding innovative ways in which biodiversity, animal health, and the health sectors can collaborate as one.
Great, thank you, Sabri. So let's take a couple of audience questions, and the first one, this is to all of you, and I'm going to read the question here. It seems that COVID has caused such significant damages globally, partly because of chronic underinvestment in areas such as health systems, wildlife conservation, and scientific research. How can countries mobilize additional resources to promote a One Health approach without competing for other scarce resources from the health and environment sectors? We only have about 5 minutes here, so anyone who wants to take a quick stab at what is a significant question, which obviously merits a longer response.
Well, if someone has the answer, they will win the $1 million prize.
I was going to say I can take a fast stab at it. I think if you look at the COVID response, and having worked in Africa for so many years, one of the things that people really panicked about was that the health systems were going to be overwhelmed. And COVID became a healthcare issue, not a public health issue. So if you approach it from that perspective of we want this to be a public health issue, then you begin to put in place mechanisms. And it doesn't become reactive, it's happened. It becomes proactive planning. What do we do to be able to prevent people from ending up in the hospital? Then you prepare really well. I think a country like Rwanda has done that very, very well, where they went ahead and they set in motion, considering the fact that, hey, if this gets into our healthcare system, we will be really overwhelmed. And so I think that's one of the ways we need to be able to look at this. If governments can begin to plan for public health issues and not healthcare issues, so that people don't show up in the emergency room, they deal with it way in advance. And I know resources are limited because of that, but prioritizing that might help in the future.
Thanks so much, Helen. Let's take one more question here, and this one is for you, Patty. Such an important and timely subject, so interesting. Has this been explained in detail to our policymakers?
Well, that's a timely question. We did a briefing this morning actually on the Hill, and we have 2 more briefings requested. So one of the things we really hope to do with this project is really have good communication with not only with our partners, but with the decision makers. And so we're developing a communication plan to make sure that as new information comes in, we're keeping it in front of them so we can answer the questions. Obviously, there's a lot of visibility right now on this topic. And so this is, I think a good time to start this project. And so we're trying to be responsive to their concerns and needs, but certainly sharing the science with them is an important first step.
That's great to hear, Patty. So we've only got a couple minutes left. Let's spend 30 seconds each of you providing some quick sort of final remarks, from your perspective, and then we'll wrap this up. Helen, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. I'll go first. I think just in conclusion I would say that it is important to identify and understand the underlying human land use determinants of infectious diseases as they relate to all this environmental defragmentation, habitat destruction and degradation, and looking at the relevant aspects of wildlife species and community behavioral ecology. I think those are really, really issues that build together. I would say it's holistic. if we just take this as one thing alone, it will not work. We have to have a holistic approach, and that's where One Health comes in. If we have this holistic approach and we have different disciplines thinking about it, then we can actually beat this, I think, and or be well prepared for it next time. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. Sabri.
I think that the key message here is let's connect the dots, let's talk, let's work together. I think if if there's one thing everybody comes out from this meeting needs to remember is that well, I think that a lot what has been done already has been fruitful. I mean, I've had more meetings with epidemiologists in the past 6 months than I've had in all my life. So things are moving ahead, but we need more of that.
Patty?
Yeah, I think just to echo what the others have said, there is a need to maintain this holistic approach to things. There's a need to maintain the resources and the networks and things that are out there and make sure that they don't fall off. And there's also a real need to think outside the box. You know, I think Helen kind of alluded to some of this as well, is we need to be reaching those, those non-traditional partners who have networks and data and other things that we can use, because that's what's going to make this work, is having all of those people involved, having them all feel like they have some ownership. And I think there's no better time to do it than right now during a global pandemic.
Thanks so much, Patty. And so we've covered a lot in this panel in obviously a very short amount of time, and there's lots more to discuss to really do this topic justice. It is, of course, very encouraging to hear from each of you about all the work that's being done in this space and the strong interest and recognition that we really do need to do much more. But obviously, coordination and collaboration, multi-sectoral approaches are really fundamental to move this forward. And in many ways, that does require a bit of a paradigm shift in another layer of complexity in how we often approach our development programming, particularly as it relates to health, environment, and agriculture. So let's thank and congratulate our three panelists, Patty, Helen, and Sabri, for an excellent job. And thank you as well to the audience for your participation, some really great questions. I look forward to what are hopefully many future opportunities to continue these discussions. So thank you again. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of the conference.